And we are rolling on May 24th, 2018, where it's kind of a gloomy day in Los Angeles. Right, Danielle? Yeah. The sunshine is not shining. I'm not happy. I guess we can't tell the East Coast to eat their heart out, can we? No. We're about to hear a debate on climate change, formerly known as global warming, for the plateau. And today we're going to hear a policy debate, specifically policy debate number 2. And that policy debate, the wording of the question is, the United States should unilaterally reduce carbon emissions regardless of whether China, India, and developing countries cooperate. I repeat, the United States should unilaterally reduce carbon emissions regardless of whether China, India, and developing countries cooperate. Speaking first for the government or the affirmative is Yashin.
Where's Pratik? I need a timer.
Pratik's not here? Oh, that's kind of rude. Anybody have an Apple phone they can time with? Oh, very good. Thank you. Okay, can you do it orally?
Yeah.
Yell it out, so forth? Yeah.
Do you want the 4-minute one, or does that not help you?
I can have just my own time on the
You do a
side.
1-minute one?
Yeah, but I want to hear
Oh,
it.
you want the 4-minute one?
Yeah.
Alright, just give
Down, 4, 3, 2, 1, halftime.
Halftime, you got it.
Alright, give me a countdown.
Whenever on you. Or on you.
And we are rolling.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yassine, and today my partner Kiara and I will tell you why the United States should unilaterally reduce carbon emissions, regardless of whether other countries cooperate. The criteria for the debate today should be weighing the benefits of unilaterally reducing carbon emissions versus the cost of doing so. You should grant adherence to the side with the best supporting evidence regarding the topic being discussed. So I'm going to start off by listing a few definitions, then move on to discuss the problem at hand, why it's happening, what a proposed solution is, and why it will work. First, we must define 3 key words. Unilaterally is something that is done or undertaken by one party, or in this case, country. Carbon emissions are the total amount of greenhouse gases produced to directly and indirectly support human activities, usually expressed in equivalent tons of carbon dioxide. Lastly, cooperate implies acting jointly toward the same end goal. Now, let's discuss the problem. Current global carbon emission levels are far above a sustainable level, and without meaningful, tangible action soon, the whole world risks potentially irreversible environmental damage, as well as negative human health and global economic consequences. The World Bank states that the United States is the world's 2nd largest emitter of CO2 after China, but according to a New York Times article from 2018, the U.S. pumped more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than any other nation between 1850, before the Civil War, and 2014. Now, basic kindergarten ethics suggests that the party responsible for causing a problem would be at the forefront of solving it. Though we do firmly stand on this moral ground, we do understand that the issue is complex and there are ulterior motives and priorities, mainly financial, environmental, and health-related, that must be addressed. I will now address the carbon emissions related environmental impacts, and afterwards will address the potential human health and economic impacts. According to the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Atmospheric Sciences, released in 2015, the frequency and severity of wildfires, as we know in the western United States, have increased as runoff from mountain snow occurs earlier, lengthening the fire season. A 2017 LA Times article cites a study in the scientific journal Nature Communications that found that rapidly melting Arctic sea ice now threatens to diminish precipitation over California by as much as 15% within 20 to 30 years. Such a change would have profound economic impacts in a state where the most recent drought drained several $billions out of the economy, severely stressed infrastructure, and highlighted how even the state most proactively confronting global warming is not prepared for its fallout. Our second point is that high carbon emissions impact human health. In 2016, the U.S. Global Change Research Program released a report that analyzes the impacts of climate change on human health in the United States. And I quote, With climate change, the frequency, severity, duration, and location of weather and climate phenomena,
4 minutes.
like rising temperature, heavy rains and droughts, and some other kinds of severe weather, are changing. This means that areas already experiencing health-threatening weather and climate phenomena, such as severe heat or hurricanes, are likely to experience worsening impacts, such as higher temperatures, increased storm intensity, rainfall rates, and storm surge. It also means that some locations will experience new climate-related health threats, end quote. I'll now address the potential ramifications high carbon emissions will have on the economy. According to a 2015 study conducted by scientists at Stanford and UC Berkeley, we have dramatically underestimated the damage human-caused climate change will do to the economy, to the global economy. By looking at data from 160 countries across the 50-year period from 1960 to 2010, the authors found that an average local temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit is economically optimal, particularly for agricultural productivity. If regional temperatures are cooler, then warming benefits the local economy, but past that peak temperature, warming reduces economic productivity. The study found that it held true for both rich and poor countries, and that the relationship held for both the 1960 to 1989 and the 1990 to 2010 timeframes. Although it is commonly believed that global warming would not impact economic growth in wealthy countries, looking at data over the past half-century, the authors found that wealthy countries have been nearly as vulnerable to temperatures warming beyond 55 degrees Fahrenheit as poorer countries. This is important because this study finds that if we continue on a business-as-usual path of high fossil fuel consumption and carbon pollution, 77% of countries will be poorer in 2100 than they would be in a world in which we curb climate change. Some countries, 5 to 43% of the world's nations, might even be poorer in the year 2100 than they are today as a result. Some argue that climate action is too expensive. However, according to a 2015 Citibank report, Citibank is the third largest bank in the United States, that looked at the economic costs and benefits of a low carbon future, it was found that the action scenario, aka reducing carbon emissions, is actually a bit cheaper than an inaction scenario. This is due to the rapidly falling cost of renewables, which, combined with lower fuel usage from energy efficiency investments, actually result in a significantly lower long-term fuel bill. Yes, we have to invest more in early years, but we save later, not to mention the liabilities of climate change that we potentially avoid. Climate change is the ultimate instance of the tragedy of the commons. There's this belief that there needs to be a global agreement before acting on carbon emissions reductions. Climate change is not an all or nothing problem, and one that certainly cannot be solved by a single country. However, any change in the right direction is good change. So, waiting for global multilateral cooperation is wasting precious time that could be spent making actual, impactful change to curb the effects of climate change. To avoid the aforementioned repercussions of not dealing with climate change, we propose that the United States implement a federal flat carbon tax, much like the one now implemented in British Columbia. I won't go too much into the details because my partner will cover it in more depth, but the carbon tax could be implemented quickly, is supported by economists, businesses, and environmentalists. The revenue generated from the carbon tax is returned to the taxpayers, who then can use that money to invest in alternative energy. There's also evidence of bipartisan support for a carbon tax, and it has been shown to grow, the tax has been shown to grow rather than slow in the economy. For these reasons, we believe that the advantages of beginning to drastically reduce carbon emissions now outweigh the costs of not doing so. Thank you. I now stand open to questions and cross-examination.
Thank you very much. Would you please come to the front of the podium and stand close together?
Ready to go?
I'm ready, sir.
So you talked a lot about the current need to cut carbon emissions and what it's doing to the environment today. Did you mention anything about the United States' current cutting efforts?
I don't believe I did.
Where would you say we rank on cutting carbon emissions right now?
Based on your brief, we're ranked first.
Yes, correct. And you said your solution is a carbon flat tax, and the tax revenue generated would be sent back. Where would the tax revenue go?
I mean, I can talk about it low now, but as I said earlier, my partner is going to go into much more detail.
Okay.
So I feel like that's a better question for the next cross-examination.
Thanks. Okay. Takes out a lot of questions. So, and then you said that China's carbon emissions were still greater than the United States, correct?
Look at me, I'm
At
the
this
king.
time, yes, but
Over here, over here, over here.
but
You're
throughout
persuading
history-
me.
Yes, China currently emits more than the United States right now, but in totality, for the past approximately 150, 170 years, the U.S. has emitted more.
Okay. Would you say that you would value economic strength over? So, so the United States does not emit more, but we have a higher GDP per capita. Would you say that's important to consider in this plan?
In what ways would it be important? All I know about per capita is that the United States consumes almost more than twice per capita than China.
Okay. Good. No further
Okay,
questions.
thank you. What was the time?
140, so 20 seconds left.
1:40. Thank you, Scott Jacob.
Good to go? Yep.
Good to go, Mr. Jacob.
I am Jacob Scott, and I will be representing the opposition with my partner on the topic of whether the United States should unilaterally reduce carbon emissions regardless of what other countries do. We take the stance that we should not, as resources would be better used in other means. So for definitions, we agree with all of that, and the criteria, we believe with them, we side with them on that. That the benefits should outweigh the costs, and that should be what you base your vote off. So what is the problem? The problem is that our world's climate is going through a period of alarming growth, global warmth, believed to be caused in part by the global carbon emissions in the past decades. How big is the problem? It's called global warming for a reason. It affects the whole world and needs to be addressed as such. And dealing with the problem unilaterally cannot be the solution. Our efforts would be alone. Among the world leaders right now, such as China and India, we basically are. China and India are not doing their share to reduce their carbon footprint, while the United States is. Dealing with the problem multilaterally has also proved to be difficult. The Paris Agreement was a mess for a few reasons. It was just an agreement with no consequences for hitting the targeted goals. There was no reason for the United States to stay in it, and President Trump backed out of it. Furthermore, the United Nations released a report in October 2017 that said the current plan to curb world collective carbon emissions is not enough. In fact, under the pledges made by all the countries that have signed, it would fail to reach its goal of the Earth getting less than 2 degrees Celsius, getting 2 degrees warmer by 2100. It would actually climb to more than 3 degrees Celsius. Reuters reported that just last year, China produced 3.45 billion tons of coal. That's up 3.2% from the previous year. So why do we have the problem? The world relies heavily on the carbon emissions for energy. Renewable energy sources are not at the capacity that we need them to be at in order to drastically reduce CO2 emissions even more. The BP Statistical Review of World Energy, released in June of 2017, provides an extensive analysis on all carbon emissions in the world. This study states that just 1.2% of the world's energy comes from wind turbines, and just 3% come from solar powered sources. So combined, that's less than 5% come from renewable sources. Therefore, we are not prepared to depend on them for energy. So what is our solution? Our pro solution has two main parts. The first is to keep the status quo, but invest in the future. The second, like I said, is to invest in the future in carbon capturing technology. We will be arguing that this policy that they propose is not necessary, as we are already reducing carbon at a record clip. Development of new technology is more critical and deserves more funding than policies to reduce carbon emissions even more. So my first point, by saying we keep the status quo, we're not saying ignore the problem entirely. The United States is already reducing more carbon emissions than any other country. Again, the BP Statistical Review of World Energy states that since 2005, annual U.S. carbon dioxide emissions have declined by 758 million metric tons. In comparison, the entire European Union just combined for just 770 million metric tons. The second largest individual country's decline was the United Kingdom, and they declined only 170 million metric tons. So 758 million metric tons is what we're declining, and the second largest country went down by 170 million. So we are already doing our part. There's no need to push a more restrictive policy such as the carbon tax. Developing carbon capturing technology is an extremely crucial step that the rest of the world isn't willing to address. The Economist in November 2017 stated that realistically speaking, any plan to cut carbon emissions needs to employ a way to suck the CO2 currently in the air out of it. And the UN did a study recently, and 106 out of the 116 plans that they had that would effectively cut the carbon dioxide in the air, or the global temperature would not exceed 2 degrees Celsius in the till 2100. 106 of those 116 plans had a way to suck the carbon emissions out of the air that are already there. So emissions simply cannot be cut fast enough to prevent a temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius. This is just as big of a deal as it is to reduce the CO2 in the air. And this technology is not new, it's being developed as we speak. Switzerland has a 3-year demonstration plan, as reported by Science Journal in 2017. My partner will go into more details about this, but briefly, the technology of this is crucial, and it's effective in sucking, storing, and reutilizing the carbon emissions that are in the air, utilizing them for purposes such as agricultural and other means. So imagine if we put the money they're suggesting in to make a policy, push a policy for carbon tax into technology that is necessary for the world. The potential for growth in that field is huge, both environmentally and economically. So will the solution work? This solution will work because the carbon sucking technology needs to be furthered, as I've said multiple times, and it will help us reach our goal. We're already reducing carbon emissions at a record clip, and reducing it more would be a wasted effort without this technology. What are the advantages? It's clear. It's spending on new technology that is sorely needed for the world's carbon cutting ways to prove useful. And people got mad at President Trump for backing out of the Paris Agreement because it took us away from being a world leader in such a topic as global warming. Now, this new technology will be innovated, and it will put us right back in the forefront of the fight against global warming. On balances, the cost of reducing carbon emissions as a policy greatly outweighs the benefits of the proposal. An investment in new technology is a better use of money. Thank you, and I am now open for questions and further clarification.
Thank you very much. Please come to the front of the podium. Stand close together.
All right, so you say that because climate